Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're embarking on a mission that really touches on some core ideas. Patriotism, citizenship, and maybe the very mechanics of democratic conversation. We are diving deep into a fascinating and maybe surprisingly contentious area, the freedom of expression for former military personnel.
It sounds niche, perhaps.
It might sound a bit niche, yeah, or technical, but the implications, as we'll see, are pretty vast. We're really unpacking this uh, profound paradox almost right at the heart of civic life. You have a soldier who retires. They're no longer under the immediate constraints of the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
Right.
But society often still expects them to stay quiet, essentially, to remain publicly restrained, maybe even silent when it comes to discussing political or social issues. And the sources we've looked at, they really zero in on the specific mechanism here. It's the perceived weight, the ongoing symbolism of the prefix of rank.
The general, the admiral.
Exactly. The public still calls them General so-and-so, Admiral such and such, long after they've swapped the uniform for civilian clothes.
Yeah, and it's an expectation that seems driven by a few things. You've got societal deference, how the media presents them, and maybe a genuine, though perhaps misplaced, concern about keeping the military institution itself apolitical. But as the research we're diving into powerfully argues, this whole expectation of silence, it's deeply flawed.
Okay.
The core of our deep dive today really comes from Chandra Nath's compelling paper, which argues that this constraint, this expectation of silence, isn't just unfair to the individual veteran, it's structurally dangerous.
Structurally dangerous. Okay, that's strong language.
It is. Nath's central thesis is, well, completely unambiguous. This expectation of silence is fundamentally undemocratic. It's directly contrary to the principle of equal citizenship. And, maybe most importantly, it represents a profound and, frankly, serious misunderstanding of how democratic life is supposed to work. We're essentially asking some of our citizens, who are arguably uniquely informed about certain aspects of state power, to sign a kind of lifetime non-disclosure agreement on the very function of the state they served.
Wow. Okay, so that's our mission for you, the listener, today.
Right.
We want to synthesize these core arguments, philosophical, constitutional, ethical, that are presented in these sources. We need to move past maybe that surface level discomfort some people feel about seeing a general speaking out publicly on, say, politics.
Right.
And really understand why suppressing these voices, as the sources say, informed by sacrifice and real operational knowledge, might actually be a subtle but persistent threat to democratic integrity itself. We need to get a handle on the costs of this silence.
Let's jump right in then, right to the heart of it. The paper's primary assertion, as you mentioned, it pulls no punches. Nath states that constraining the public expression of veterans, specifically because of their prior service and that sticky rank prefix, is a dangerous misconception of civic life.
Okay, dangerous misconception. Let's unpack dangerous. What's the danger here, according to the source?
Well, when the paper uses dangerous, it's not just rhetoric. It's pointing to a specific structural failure in how democracy should function. This constraint is seen as a direct threat to two foundational things.
Okay.
First, democratic discourse itself gets impoverished. You lose valuable perspectives. Second, and maybe even more fundamentally, it threatens the principle of equal civic agency.
Equal civic agency.
Yeah, the argument is pretty straightforward. Silencing any group of citizens based purely on their past job fundamentally distorts the marketplace of ideas. And when that specific group is the one most intimately familiar with a state's instruments of power, well, that distortion becomes pretty critical, doesn't it?
That language, dangerous misconception, it does feel intentionally provocative. And going back to that core thesis, the claim is that believing former soldiers should be restrained is undemocratic and contrary to the principles of equal citizenship. And then there's that even stronger claim you mentioned. To enforce this silence is to misread democracy itself. I want to push on that a bit. How does asking a retired general to, maybe pipe down, how does that amount to misreading democracy? Isn't democracy also about stability, about trust in institutions like the military?
It absolutely is about stability and trust.
Yeah.
But Nath argues that kind of stability, that trust, it has to be earned through open, robust debate, not enforced by filtering out certain voices. The misreading happens when we confuse the necessary discipline required within an active military force.
Right, which everyone understands.
With the necessary, sometimes messy, diversity of civilian political life. The two are different spheres. The democratic mechanism that breaks down, according to this view, is the proper vetting of policy. Let's say you have a debate about, I don't know, funding a new weapons system or pursuing a particular geopolitical strategy.
Okay.
Arguably, the most valuable voices in that public discussion are those who've actually executed similar missions or commanded troops in similar situations. If those voices are muted, either by self-censorship or external pressure,
Then the debate shifts.
exactly, the public debate defaults to theory, maybe political rhetoric, or academic speculation. It gets divorced from the operational reality, from the how things actually work on the ground.
That's a really crucial distinction. It's not just about silencing someone's political opinion like any other citizens. It's about silencing operational expertise that could actually validate or invalidate a proposed policy.
Precisely. And that's where this concept of equal civic agency really bites. Think about it.
Oh.
If I'm a retired teacher, I keep my full civic agency.
Sure.
I can speak out on education policy, I can endorse candidates, I can even use my former status as a teacher, as a former educator, to add weight to my opinion. Nobody expects me to stop being a citizen just because I stopped being a teacher.
Right. So why is the prefix of rank used as the lever for constraint only for the military? Why does the connection to, say, military command or state power somehow seem to negate their civic autonomy after retirement in a way that being a former top diplomat or treasury official doesn't?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The prefix of rank, the retained honorific like general or admiral, it acts as this permanent, very visible marker of the veteran's unique status and the significant power they once wielded. Society seems to fear that this lingering status carries an implicit threat, perhaps. Or maybe it suggests wrongly the involvement or endorsement of the active military and political matters.
So the constraint isn't usually legal, it's more social.
It operates mainly through social pressure, yeah.
Mm.
Media gatekeeping plays a role. And sometimes, maybe there's a subtle institutional fear concern about potential backlash against the veterans' peers who are still serving if someone speaks out too forcefully. It becomes this kind of psychological constraint, built largely on a fear of the military's potential influence in politics.
Okay.
But the paper argues this whole setup is fundamentally flawed. Why? Because it effectively establishes a kind of conditional citizenship.
Conditional citizenship. Explain that.
Well, equal civic agency means every citizen has the right to participate equally in the political and social life of the nation, full stop, regardless of their past career. When a veteran speaks, and the public or the media immediately filters their view through that lens of general, and it implicitly demands that the rank be neutralized by silence.
Yeah.
Well, we're essentially conditioning their agency based on their non-civilian past. Their fundamental rights are, in practice, being treated as subordinate to the comfort or perhaps the anxieties of the civilian public.
And going back to that idea of misreading democracy, it suggests we're prioritizing the appearance of an apolitical military over the actual necessary function of having informed public debate, especially on issues where military experience is directly relevant.
It absolutely looks like a prioritization of optics over substance. By focusing so heavily on the rank, we're implicitly saying this group must be treated differently. Their agency is conditional. Think about the message it sends. These individuals may have risked their lives upholding constitutional ideals, and now society is effectively demanding they accept a civic handicap because of that very service. That's a structural inequality Nath is identifying.
Right.
We seem to demand that the people who hold the most intimate knowledge of the state's instruments of power, its capabilities, its limitations, its human costs, remain silent. We end up fearing their insight more than we value their potential contribution to public understanding. That exclusion, the sources argue, is completely antithetical to a democracy committed to self-governance. If a democracy is truly mature, truly robust, it should be able to handle informed dissent, shouldn't it? Even when that dissent comes wearing the scars, so to speak, of deep institutional knowledge.
And just to be absolutely clear on the scope here, the sources aren't arguing veterans should be free to spill classified secrets, right? That's a separate issue.
Absolutely not. That's covered by existing laws and oaths. We're talking specifically about the public expression of political or social opinions.
So everything from critiques of foreign policy planning, where their knowledge is arguably paramount,
Right.
all the way to domestic issues, where they're speaking simply as concerned citizens who happen to have a military background. It's the entire spectrum of public life we seem to be asking them to limit themselves on.
Yes, exactly. The constraint is broad, it's often subtle, maybe unspoken, but it's persistent. And the core argument from the sources is, look, if a democracy requires anything, it requires the most informed voices possible at the table. To willfully muzzle those who have the most intimate, often life or death, knowledge of the state's capabilities and instruments, Well, that's by definition an act of intellectual self-impoverishment for the whole society. It just turns political debate into a less informed, less grounded exercise.
Okay, that leads us neatly into the next section, this idea of the unequal burden. This is where the systemic nature of this constraint really starts to jump out, doesn't it? The critique in the sources is that we apply these radically inconsistent expectations for silence among former public servants. Why is this burden seemingly applied so specifically to the military?
Right, this section really highlights what the paper calls a discriminatory double standard. And it suggests a kind of societal bias, maybe unconscious, against military expertise when it enters the civic realm. Think about it. Consider a former U.S. ambassador to, say, a major European country,
Hmm.
or a retired deputy secretary of the Treasury, or even a former FBI director.
Okay.
They leave their post, and almost immediately what happens? They're snapped up by think tanks, they get contributor roles on news networks, political parties court them.
Yeah, they become commentators, advisors.
Exactly. They write op-eds, they participate in political fundraising, often quite visibly, and they routinely leverage their past titles, former ambassador so-and-so, former director Smith, to lend weight to their critiques of current policy or the current administration.
And society doesn't just accept this. We often actively seek it out, right? We consume their commentary. We view their institutional experience as a key qualification, a reason to listen to them participate in policy debates.
Absolutely. We understand intuitively that a former diplomat's view on foreign aid is valuable precisely because they administered it. We get that connection. But veterans, the sources argue, face these unique pressures. If a former four-star general speaks out, even on issues that might seem directly related to their expertise, like veterans' healthcare policy, or maybe even something broader like climate change's impact on national security, the commentary is often received with suspicion.
Suspicion or calls for them to stay out of it.
Right. There's this expectation, usually unwritten, often just a sort of atmospheric pressure, that the military servant, unlike the civilian servant, should just fade into silent retirement,
Mm.
especially if their commentary is critical of the ruling political class, whoever that may be at the time.
So the constraint seems specifically tied to the military uniform, even long after it's been hung up. Why is the act of having commanded military resources viewed as potentially disqualifying for public debate, while having commanded, say, diplomatic or financial resources is seen as a positive qualification? What's the core difference in perception?
The sources suggest the core difference lies in that perceived connection to violence, to lethal force, and maybe the unique political sensitivities surrounding the military institution itself. There's this deep-seated fear, perhaps, that a political general is the first step towards a political army, or even worse, thoughts of instability or coup.
A fear that might be legitimate in some contexts, historically or globally.
Absolutely. It's a legitimate fear in fragile democracies or places with a history of military intervention in politics. But the sources argue that in robust, established democracies like the U.S. or Western Europe, this fear is often overplayed. And more worryingly, it's being used, consciously or unconsciously, as a justification for systemic exclusion of a particular group's expertise. The underlying assumption seems to be that military service somehow pollutes the individual's ability to engage in civil discourse impartially. Or maybe that their command experience makes their voice too powerful, too potentially coercive in the political arena.
Which leads us directly to this idea of the perverse consequence mentioned in the outline, a really potent claim from the sources, that this double standard effectively converts a badge of honor into a lifelong constraint. That really lands hard. It suggests a profound injustice.
It really does. It creates what feels like an almost existential penalty for having chosen military service. Think about it from the individual's point of view. A citizen volunteers, they serve, potentially enduring trauma, operating under incredibly strict discipline, taking an oath to defend the Constitution. They achieve rank through merit, performance, sacrifice. Yet, upon leaving that service, they're implicitly told, well, because you excelled in serving the nation in this specific way, you must now accept a diminished public status, that badge of honor you earned. It's now effectively a gag order in the public square. Just think about the individual veteran. If they'd chosen a different path, say, a career in academia or law or civil service, they would likely leave that service with enhanced credentials for public commentary. Their experience would be seen as an asset.
Right.
But because they chose the military, they often leave with what feels like a political liability. The very rank that should signify their deep expertise and commitment is instead used as a reason to constrain their voice. The sources argue this amounts to a subtle but real form of political disenfranchisement based solely on career choice. It treats military service not as a foundation for informed citizenship, but almost as a disqualifier for full, unconstrained civic participation later on. And that, the paper suggests, is an unacceptable moral paradox in a nation that claims to honor its veterans.
And this constraint, it doesn't just silence them on specific issues, it potentially forces them into more sanitized, maybe less controversial public roles if they want to speak at all. It could limit the pool of experienced leaders who might otherwise transition into politics or high-level policy roles, couldn't it?
Exactly. It inevitably narrows the talent pool available for public service and debate. And think about the chilling effect. The underlying message, particularly maybe to junior officers or NCOs looking ahead, seems clear. If you aspire to high office or want to engage in meaningful public debate after your military career, you need to be extremely careful about expressing any strong opinions now. And even then, your military past, your rank, might be used against you later.
Which is a stark contrast to the expectations for civilian leaders.
A very stark contrast. Civilian leaders in government often use their tenure quite explicitly to build a public profile, to establish expertise, maybe laying the groundwork for future political endeavors or influential commentary roles. So pulling it all together, synthesizing the impact. We see this discriminatory situation. Service members, once they leave the discipline of active duty, are uniquely hobbled compared to their counterparts from, say, the State Department or the Treasury or the Justice Department. The message society seems to send is that knowledge gained in a non-military government capacity, bureaucracy, diplomacy, law enforcement, is an asset that enhances public life. But knowledge gained in a military capacity must be carefully managed, maybe even silenced, for the perceived good of public order or institutional neutrality. The sources argue this differentiation just doesn't hold up logically. It constitutes a structural breach of the commitment to equal citizenship rights for all.
So even if the underlying law, the Constitution, grants them full civic autonomy upon retirement, the constraint is operating at a powerful social level. It functions almost like law in its effect. That's the unequal burden we're talking about.
Precisely. And that's why the sources then turn to the legal and ethical foundations to dismantle that social constraint.
Right, so let's move into that. Section 3. Constitutional and ethical frameworks for dissent. How do the sources challenge the social pressure using the bedrock of law and philosophy?
Well, to really push back against this powerful social norm, the sources ground the argument very firmly in the constitutional landscape. We have to start with what they present as a non-negotiable legal assertion.
Yeah.
A veteran's fundamental citizenship rights are not diminished just because they served in the military in the past. They are full citizens, period. End of story, constitutionally speaking.
Okay, the baseline is full citizenship.
And we have to highlight the specific constitutional foundation they point to, freedom of expression. It's often referred to in the sources using terms like an inalienable right of every citizen. Now, that word inalienable is doing a lot of work there. It means this right cannot be given away, it can't be traded, it can't be stripped from you as a condition of past employment, even employment that, for operational reasons, required temporary restrictions on that right.
So the military discipline restrictions were temporary and conditional.
Exactly. While military discipline requires temporary, context-specific operational restrictions on speech that's understood and legally permissible the moment that discipline is formally lifted, the inalienable right must, legally and logically, snap back into place. Fully, unconditionally.
That constitutional baseline then sets up this crucial transition point, doesn't it? The shift from active military service to civilian life. The sources seem to make this distinction absolutely crystal clear, emphasizing that once retired, former soldiers are, legally speaking, no longer under military discipline. And this seems like the legal firewall. While someone's on active duty, the restrictions on speech, maybe not publicly criticizing the commander-in-chief, the need to maintain unit cohesion, avoiding partisan political activity in uniform, those are legally justified under what's sometimes called the operational necessity doctrine or military necessity.
Well, yet order and discipline.
But the instant that retirement paperwork is signed, sealed, delivered, that legal justification just vanishes completely. So the crucial implication in legally is that they now possess complete civic freedom, or as one source puts it, full civic autonomy. To try and maintain the constraint after retirement is essentially an attempt to impose the rules of military discipline onto the civilian realm, and that's legally incoherent and philosophically inconsistent with how a democracy is supposed to function.
That legal distinction is absolutely everything. Discipline is a temporary necessity for an operational force. Civic autonomy is a permanent foundational right for every single citizen in a liberal democracy. The veteran is entitled, legally, to the full restoration of that autonomy the very moment they step off active service. So, any societal expectation, any pressure that insists they must continue to adhere to a kind of discipline of silence. Well, from this perspective, it's essentially an extra-legal infringement. It's violating their constitutional rights through social means.
Okay, so the legal case seems quite clear, but the argument goes deeper, right? It moves from law into philosophy. You mentioned the paper delves into the philosophical underpinnings of why dissent itself isn't just a right, but actually a necessity for a healthy democracy.
Exactly. This is where Nath brings in some philosophical heavyweights to explain why the veteran's voice isn't just permissible, but actually required for a truly functioning democracy. The paper specifically draws on insights from John Stuart Mill and Hannah Arendt.
Okay, Mill and Arendt. Let's spend a bit of time here, as the outline noted this connection is important. Why do thinkers like Mill and Arendt specifically lend support to this idea that robust public discourse actually requires voices informed by sacrifice, as the source puts it? Let's start with Mill. His idea of the collision of ideas leading to truth is famous. How does the veteran's voice fit into Mill's framework, maybe preventing what he called dead dogma?
Right. Mill, in On Liberty, argued really fiercely that truth, or at least the closest approximation we can get to it, emerges from the collision of competing viewpoints. He was deeply worried about ideas becoming dead dogma.
Beliefs we hold just because they're familiar, not because they've been tested.
Exactly. Beliefs held not because they've been vigorously debated, challenged, and have withstood scrutiny, but simply because they've never been seriously challenged, perhaps because dissenting views were suppressed or absent. Now, when institutional knowledge, like the real feasibility of certain military operations, the actual human cost of conflict, the logistical nightmares involved when that kind of knowledge is filtered out of the public debate.
The debate becomes abstract.
Precisely. The remaining discussion becomes theoretical, abstract, maybe overly academic or purely political. The veteran's voice in Mill's framework is crucial because it prevents discussions about military and foreign policy from hardening into that kind of dead dogma. Their perspective isn't abstract theory. It's knowledge that's been, as one source vividly puts it, forged in the crucible of state action. When a retired general, or maybe a former sergeant with extensive combat experience, critiques a proposed war plan, they aren't just offering an opinion. They're bringing the brutal reality of logistics, troop morale, unintended consequences, maybe the political realities on the ground in that region, into what might otherwise be a sanitized, overly optimistic, theoretical debate among civilians. Their opposition to, or support for, a policy is informed by a profound, often visceral understanding of what that policy actually entails in terms of human lives and material resources. Silencing them allows policy discussions, especially around war and peace, to become a comfortable, perhaps dangerously unexamined dogma.
That really elevates the veteran's voice beyond just another opinion. Their potential contribution is unique because it's grounded in a specific, often harsh reality, not just theory or ideology. Okay, so that's Mill. How does Hannah Arendt's philosophy, maybe her ideas about the public sphere and political action, reinforce this claim?
Arendt's focus was very much on the public realm, the space where citizens come together to engage in meaningful political action, primarily through speech and persuasion. For Arendt, genuine political action, the kind that shapes a common world, requires active participation and, crucially, a diversity of experiences and perspectives being brought into that public space.
Diversity of experience is key for her.
Yes. And the experience of the military veteran, particularly regarding concepts like sacrifice, duty, the relationship between the individual and the state, the ultimate responsibilities that come with wielding state power, this experience grants them a unique kind of standing, a unique legitimacy within that Arendtian public sphere. Arendt would likely argue that to exclude the veteran's viewpoint simply because of their past service is to arbitrarily impoverish the public discourse. Their voice speaks from a place of incredibly intense lived experience, an experience that for many has literally involved putting aside individual self-interest, sometimes even survival instinct, for a perceived collective good or constitutional principle. This experience, the sources suggest following Arendt, imbues their political statements with a particular kind of moral weight. It challenges purely self-interested political calculation or detached academic theorizing. Remember that phrase the paper uses. Their opinion is informed by sacrifice. In an Arendtian sense, that sacrifice creates a powerful ethical claim on the public's attention. It's not that they're always right, but their perspective comes from a place others simply haven't been. If we silence them, we are, in effect, choosing to ignore one of the most intense forms of civic experience available in our society. And doing so weakens the vitality, the seriousness, and maybe even the legitimacy of that public realm our prize so highly.
So the message from both the constitutional grounding and these philosophical underpinnings seems really clear. The constraints on speech during active duty, necessary for operational effectiveness.
Yeah.
But extending that silence, whether explicitly or implicitly, into retirement, that's seen as both legally invalid and a grave philosophical mistake. Because it intentionally removes a uniquely qualified, perhaps uniquely necessary voice from the democratic conversation. It reduces the depth, the reality check function of our public debate, and potentially makes us more susceptible to political rhetoric that's completely untethered from the realities of implementation or consequence.
Absolutely. The sources use these frameworks, law and philosophy, to build a very strong case that the constraint itself is fundamentally anti-democratic. The health of a democratic society, they argue, isn't measured by the quiet obedience of its former servants, but by the intellectual robustness and the experiential diversity of its public debates.
Okay, but we do have to tackle the main counter-argument, the reason this issue persists. Section 4 is about navigating the symbolism of rank and the deference it commands. We have to acknowledge the primary concern, which is arguably the most legitimate one driving this demand for silence. It's that symbolism of the rank itself. The public worry, or perhaps the worry within parts of the political or even military establishment, is that the prefix General Admiral lends this undue, maybe unearned authority to a political opinion. The fear is it makes a comment sound less like a private citizen's view and more like some kind of quasi-official declaration from the military establishment itself, and that could potentially confuse the public or maybe even coerce the electorate in subtle ways.
And that concern isn't entirely unfounded, is it? Because the military institution must remain fiercely apolitical in a democracy. Public trust depends on the perception and the reality that the active military isn't aligning itself with one political faction or ideology over another. However, the paper argues quite forcefully that while the potential problem, the risk of undue influence stemming from the rank might be real, the proposed solution, censorship or enforced silence, is absolutely the wrong way to go. Rank, they argue, should never be used as a rationale to preclude veterans from participating in public speech. The solution isn't silencing the speaker, it's about increasing the responsibility of the listener, and critically, the media, to provide context.
Ah, okay. So this is the crucial pivot point in the argument, isn't it? Moving away from constraint and towards clarity. The paper's proposed safeguard against misunderstanding or undue influence is summed up in that phrase. Transparency and context, not censorship. This feels like a key policy recommendation emerging from the sources.
It absolutely is.
Let's really detail the mechanics of this transparency idea. How is it supposed to work in practice? And why do the sources argue that the solution honors the veterans' constitutional rights while also protecting the democratic public from potential coercion or confusion about institutional endorsement?
Well, transparency, in this context, means ensuring the public is given all the necessary data points to correctly decode the speech they're hearing or reading. When a veteran speaks publicly, especially on political or controversial matters, the context needs to be made absolutely explicit.
Explicit how?
They are retired, full stop. Their views do not represent the Department of Defense, the Army, the Navy, any branch of the service. They are speaking solely as a private citizen who just happens to possess a unique background and experience. Providing this context up front and clearly allows the public to properly evaluate the opinion on its merits, separating the person's experience from any perceived institutional weight.
So, practically speaking, what might that look like?
For instance, if a retired general is appearing on a cable news program to discuss, say, foreign policy,
Yeah.
the standard practice, according to this argument, should be an immediate, clear, perhaps even permanent on-screen disclaimer. General John Doe, retired, speaking as a private citizen.
Not just a quick mention at the start.
Ideally, something more persistent, especially in visual media. This approach respects the veteran's inalienable right to expression, while proactively shielding the public from the perception, mistaken or otherwise, of institutional endorsement. And significantly, the sources argue that the primary burden for providing this clarity rests heavily on the media outlets, the think tanks, the political organizations that are hosting or publishing the veterans' views. It shouldn't primarily be on the veteran themselves who, after all, have already fulfilled their service obligation. The platform has a responsibility.
Okay, I can already hear the skeptic's immediate objection, though. Couldn't a savvy veteran, even with a disclaimer slapped on the screen, still strategically use that rank symbolism? Couldn't they leverage the residual prestige and deference associated with being a general to unfairly amplify their political message, essentially lending the credibility of the entire military institution to a partisan stance, regardless of the fine print?
That potential for someone to try and leverage the rank is definitely acknowledged in the sources. It's a real possibility. But the way the argument frames it is crucial. This should be seen as a potential ethical failing of the individual veteran choosing to act that way, not as a valid reason to penalize the entire class of citizens by demanding silence from everyone.
So deal with the misuse, not ban the use.
It's exactly. The analogy might be, we don't silence all retired politicians just because some might exploit their former titles or connections for personal gain after leaving office. We generally accept that possibility as, perhaps, an unfortunate cost of free civic engagement in a complex society. The solution, the sources propose, must be to demand higher ethical standards from those individuals and greater clarity and context for the platforms giving them voice. It's not to restrict speech across the board. If a retired admiral, say, makes a blatantly false or misleading claim while clearly leaning on their former status for credibility, the remedy isn't wishing they'd stayed silent. The remedy is critique, it's contradiction, it's factual correction from others, including potentially other veterans. It's the rough and tumble of robust democratic debate itself, not preemptive silence. So the key distinction they keep coming back to is between constraint and context. The argument is fundamentally about providing more information to the public transparency about who is speaking and in what capacity, not less expression from the veteran. To demand silence is, in a way, implicitly stating that the public is incapable, that citizens can't process complex information, can't think critically when a military rank is attached to a speaker. And that, the sources suggest, is actually more of an indictment of our view of the democratic capacity of the public itself, rather than a valid reason to curb the veteran's right to speak.
That's a really interesting flip. So if the public, or parts of it, demand silence, maybe they're inadvertently signaling a deeper insecurity about their own ability to differentiate between a personal political view expressed by someone with a military past and an official institutional declaration.
Could be.
The transparency approach then actually challenges the public to exercise critical thinking. It treats the rank not as a stop sign or an automatic stamp of approval, but as an additional layer of context to consider when evaluating the message.
Precisely. It aims to turn the rank from a potential shield used to silence the speaker or a source of unearned authority into simply a data point for the listener. A potentially very valuable data point, signifying experience, but not signifying infallibility or institutional backing. Transparency allows that experience to inform the debate without granting the opinion automatic, unearned governmental authority. It trusts the public to weigh it appropriately.
Okay, that makes sense as a framework. Now, to really grasp the significance of this debate, the sources suggest we need to broaden our lens, look internationally. Section 5 brings in a comparative perspective. How does this debate about veterans' voices fit into a global context?
Right. Placing this domestic debate within a global context is really important, according to the sources, because it helps us see what's at stake. They argue that how a nation treats the public speech of its former military personnel can actually act as a kind of litmus test for its democratic health. It involves contrasting our practices, or proposed practices, with international norms.
So let's start by defining those democratic norms as detailed in the sources. What's typical in what we might consider healthy, established democracies, say, across Western Europe, Canada, Australia, places like that?
Well, the general observation in the sources is that in these kinds of established democracies, the contributions of veterans to public life, and that explicitly includes politically contentious public life, are generally viewed as meaningful and valuable.
Not just tolerated, but valued.
Valued, yes. Their unique, informed perspective, gained through service, is often seen as an asset to be integrated into the national conversation, not a liability that needs to be contained or managed. You see former military leaders in these countries transition, often quite seamlessly, into roles as public commentators, advisors, sometimes leaders of political parties, or holding high-level policymaking positions in subsequent civilian governments.
So that integration is seen as normal, even beneficial.
It's presented as a sign of democratic maturity. The thinking is a political system that is genuinely confident in the principle of civilian supremacy over the military doesn't fear institutional knowledge entering the public sphere. It doesn't panic when a former general critiques government policy.
Because the lines are clear.
Because the lines between the retired individual and the active institution are understood and maintained, often through transparency measures like we just discussed. When a democracy is robust, it can actually encourage those who have commanded its instruments of power to share the operational realities, the lessons learned, the potential pitfalls. This level of integration where veterans aren't penalized or viewed with suspicion simply for having deep knowledge indicates a system strong enough to handle informed dissent without fearing institutional collapse or the perceived political hijacking of the armed forces. They basically view this expertise as a public resource, not a public threat.
Okay, so that's the benchmark of a mature democracy, according to these sources. What about the other side of the coin? The suppression or even just the strong expectation of silence for these voices? What does that signify internationally?
This is where the argument takes a sharp and rather concerning turn. The paper draws a very specific and frankly troubling parallel. It explicitly states that the expectation of silencing veterans' voices or actively suppressing them is a practice that aligns with authoritarian tendencies. This comparative claim is really crucial for evaluating the quality and direction of our own democratic practices.
That's a heavy charge linking what might seem like a domestic social pressure or a debate about propriety directly to the hallmarks of authoritarianism. Why? Why is the silencing of former military officials, people who hold deep institutional knowledge, considered a hallmark of authoritarian regimes? What's the core logic connecting those two?
The core link, according to the analysis, is the control of narrative. Authoritarian regimes, almost by definition, rely fundamentally on maintaining a single official narrative. This is especially true when it comes to narratives about the efficiency, the competence, the strength, maybe even the infallibility of state power, particularly its armed forces. The military is often a key pillar of legitimacy for such regimes.
Right, the strong, unified front.
Exactly. Now, consider a former high-ranking military official in that system who is free to dissent publicly. Someone who can critique strategy based on experience, expose logistical failures, talk about morale problems, or reveal inconvenient truths about casualties, even if none of that information is technically classified state secrets. That individual represents a direct, high-credibility threat to the state's carefully constructed, centralized narrative.
Because their word carries weight.
Immense weight. In an authoritarian state, the military's credibility is usually tightly controlled and leveraged by the ruling party or leader. If a former general is allowed to step into the public sphere and say, actually the official story's wrong, the deployment strategy was fundamentally unsound, or the defense budget is being massively misspent on vanity projects, that statement carries significant, almost unassailable weight precisely because of their background. It shatters the government's monopoly on the truth about the armed forces. Authoritarian states simply cannot tolerate that kind of highly credible, informed dissent because it exposes potential weaknesses, suggests internal fragility, and directly challenges their control over information and ultimately power. So silencing those voices preemptively, maybe through intimidation, threats to pensions or privileges, trumped-up legal charges, or just intense social pressure, becomes a cheap and effective tactic to ensure the public only hears the government-approved version of events.
So the act of silencing veterans is, in essence, an attempt to control institutional memory and the public narrative around state power, which is exactly what less free societies prioritize over open debate.
That's precisely the connection the sources draw. When any society, even one that considers itself democratic, starts to prioritize the silence of its knowledgeable former officials over informed debate, even if it's done subtly, through social norms rather than overt censorship it is, perhaps unconsciously, adopting the mechanisms and priorities of centralized control. Therefore, valuing the veteran's voice, even when that voice is challenging, critical, or uncomfortable, becomes an indicator of genuine democratic maturity. It shows confidence in the system's ability to absorb, debate, and ultimately reconcile informed dissent without crumbling. Silencing them, conversely, suggests fragility, maybe a latent fear of expertise or an underlying tendency towards managing information rather than allowing it to circulate freely and be contested openly.
So the choice we make as a society between transparency and context on one hand and pressure towards silence or outright constraint on the other, it becomes, in this comparative view, a direct measure of our actual fidelity to robust democratic principles, as opposed to maybe just prioritizing a superficial sense of stability or order.
That's the argument laid out. It reframes the entire debate.
Which brings us towards wrapping this up. Let's move to the conclusion. How do the sources forcefully bring all these threads together?
Well, the conclusion really circles back to restate that core thesis with force. The expectation that former soldiers must remain silent, primarily because of their prefix of rank, isn't just legally questionable or socially unfair, it is presented as deeply detrimental to the political health and the intellectual vitality of the nation. The bottom line is this. The voices of veterans are framed not as a problem to be managed, but as an essential asset to a democratic society. An asset that must be protected, must be heard, not constrained.
And it emphasizes that unique perspective again.
Absolutely. It's paramount to reinforce that concept. We discuss their unique perspective, forged through service, as the source puts it, actively enriches public discourse. This isn't merely about fairness to the individual veteran, though that's important. It's about the health of the democracy itself. It's about integrating critical, reality-check insight into how we make decisions, especially about security, foreign policy, and the use of state power. Democracy thrives fundamentally on the clash of well-informed opinions. Mill was right about that. When we deliberately exclude or subtly treasure into silence those who have often sacrificed the most and arguably understand the true costs and logistical complexities of state power better than almost anyone else. Well, we're making a willful choice. We're choosing to engage in public debate that is potentially intellectually shallower and perhaps operationally more naive than it needs to be. So, to synthesize the main takeaways for you, the listener, from our dive today, we started by identifying that unequal burden, the seemingly unfair double standard applied specifically to military veterans compared to other former public servants regarding public speech. We then grounded the veterans' right to speak firmly in constitutional autonomy, making that clear distinction. Retirement means the immediate restoration of full civic freedom. This legal right is powerfully backed, as we saw, by philosophical arguments from thinkers like Mill and Arendt, who emphasize the absolute necessity of diverse, informed dissent for a healthy democracy.
Right. Dissent isn't just a right, it's functional.
Exactly. And finally, we explored the proposed democratic solution to managing the undeniable symbolism and potential influence of rank. Not censorship, not enforced silence, but a commitment to transparency and providing context. The argument is clear. The cost of silence is simply too high for a functioning democracy. The source material really compels us, I think, to move beyond simply treating veterans as passive symbols of sacrifice, rolled out on holidays, and instead to see them and enable them to be active, critical, and knowledgeable participants in ongoing civic life. Their service grants them special insight. It shouldn't impose a special silence. And perhaps we could leave you with that final, powerful quote from the sources, which really encapsulates the entire ethical dimension we've explored today. Their voices, informed by sacrifice, deserve not constraint, but respect. And respect, in this context, means listening. It means engaging with the ideas seriously on their merits. It means challenging the claims factually when necessary. It means applying the necessary context about who is speaking. It absolutely does not mean demanding silence simply because the voice carries the echo of a hard-earned title and deep experience.
A strong note to end the main discussion on. Now for our final segment, that provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. If the sources we've explored today are correct, if transparency really is the true safeguard, the genuinely democratic way to manage the inherent power associated with the prefix of rank, then what specific standards of context should actually be required when a veteran speaks publicly? Should media outlets, for instance, treat providing that speaking as a private citizen context as a strict, perhaps legally enforceable standard, or is it simply an ethical guideline they should aspire to?
That's a thorny question.
It is, and maybe even more complex. Where exactly should society draw the line between a veteran offering a genuinely informed, necessary civic opinion based on their unique experience, and the act of a retired individual perhaps cynically leveraging the symbolism of rank primarily for partisan political advantage or personal gain? How do we distinguish valuable insight from manipulation? Answering that forces us to examine not just the rights and responsibilities of the veteran speaker, but also the ethical obligations of the media platforms, and maybe, ultimately, the maturity and sophistication of our own critical listening skills as citizens. Something to think about. We really appreciate you going on this deep dive with us today. Until next time, keep seeking context.